Me. Also great to be here, great to be back in York and see so many friends. Um, the topic I chose for this is Infants Without Invasion, Ireland 1035 to 1166. Where's my, oh yeah, sorry. Ireland wasn't part of the Norman world, strictly speaking, in a narrow definition. We weren't invaded from England and Wales until 1169. So Henry II is king, so it's an Angevin king. But that's a very narrow definition of what Norman means, and we've been breaking down that narrow definition today. But I've framed this lecture by Duke William, 1035, and Dermot MacMurchada, 1166. It's Dermot, who's the king of Southeast Ireland, who gets booted out by other Irish kings, and he goes looking for mercenary help, and that's what brings the Anglo-Normans to Ireland a couple of years later. One of the things that's emerged today is the complexity of the terminology, the ethnic labels, Norman English, etc., etc. And when I talk to students about the difficulty of understanding ethnic identity, I always tell them to look at a section of Gerald of Wales's Expugnatio, his account of the invasion of Ireland. Gerald is to us what our Derek Vitalis is to you and other people. He chronicled what happened, and he puts a speech in the mouth of Maurice Fitzgerald in Dublin. And Maurice is one of the first Anglo-Norman knights to come to Ireland. And Maurice says to his fellow Anglo-Norman soldiers in Dublin, he said, "Look, we're in a spot of bother here, so we need to, we need a big sort of group hug and decide what we're going to do. But let's just recognize, first of all, the problem that we have. And the problem is, and I'm paraphrasing him, but only just, he says, to the English, we're Irish. To the Irish, we are English." And there's a really important contemporary comment on the nature of ethnic identity. Maurice, or rather Gerald, recognizes that from the moment they relocate, their identity has changed. They don't even need to do anything. They don't even need to, show a propensity to listen to Irish music. They are just simply different because they have moved. So relocation is itself a transformative thing. So we're not Norman in a very narrow sense, but of course the men who led the invasion were all born when Henry I or King Stephen were around. So they belong in the Angevin world in a political sense, but they are they're Norman by descent, whatever that means. I've got 4 little parts to this, each of which takes a different topic. I just got to ruminate on these. The first one I called this recognizing change last night when I was sitting in the hotel, circa 9:50 to 10:50, and it turned out to be quite prescient in that we heard Gregor and his chickens this morning talking about the year 1000 AD, and there at lunch, myself and Dawn and Sarah and David were talking about the 10th century as being a very significant century, and it is for us in Ireland as well. And it seems to me that one of the most difficult periods of time for Irish archaeologists to understand what's happening is this period from the second half of the 10th century to the middle of the 11th century. And 1050, this is before Hastings. So before the Normans are here on this island, we've got a whole century of confusion. I want to address that because I think it's pertinent to the wider issue, not just the wider issue of my lecture, but also to the wider issue of this workshop. One of the problems, and there are multiple problems, one of the problems, for example, is understanding how does Ireland go from a world of tiny little churches like this. It's very, very quaint, but Winchester Cathedral, it is not. So how do we go from this sort of small stone church with a lot of timber churches as well, to having a Romanesque style, which is part of an international movement? Do these things just carry on until one day or 1 year, over a period of several short years, suddenly chevrons start to appear? That's a big question. It seems to me that within this 950-1050 period, one of the indicators of significant change, and important that this will become apparent in just a minute, is the appearance of round towers. And they begin to appear around the middle of the 10th century, and then they carry on up even into the early 13th century. They last for about 300 years. It's quite a long period. But these seem to me to be really important, and we've undervalued them. Traditionally, they're regarded by Irish scholars as being bell towers, because Clígteach, which is the word which appears in the Irish sources, means a bell tower, or rather a bell house. But I've argued, I won't repeat the argument here, but I've argued in a couple of articles in the book that these actually are consecrated buildings. They contained high altars at the very top, and that the doorways were elevated as display doorways. And you'll know display doorways from Norman buildings. Doorways are first floor level, which from which you can be seen when you stand in the doorway. And I've discussed how these are more sort of processions within them, etc., etc., etc. The important point I want to make here to you, because I think this is germane to the entire discussion of this workshop, is that I think these are built under royal patronage. These are about kings. The few towers which we have, which we can date historically, we date them because there are records of kings building them, or kings being killed in them. And the one on the left here at Kells, this was built in the early 1000s, in 1075 or thereabouts. I say thereabouts, by the way, because the different Irish annalistic sources never quite agree on a date. So they're always sort of 2 or 3 years out. But around the year 1075, a recently crowned king of Tara is ambushed by a rival king in the doorway of the Round Tower in Kells. And the annalists say that because he's killed in the Round Tower, there's all sorts of hell to pay when this guy meets his maker. That's a really bad thing to do. On the right-hand side is Devonish. About 100 years later, about 1175, the son of the king of Fermanagh is brought by the people of Fermanagh to the Round Tower of Devonish and killed. And today, there is, at the bottom of the Round Tower, it's not here, there's the base of a round tower, and this is the second tower on the site, and architecturally you would date that tower here to about the 1170s. It's got bits of sculpture. So clearly what they did was they brought this man in, they killed him, they demolished the round tower, and then they built a new one. If these are simply bell houses, what are kings doing, being ambushed or being murdered within these things? So these are monuments which are part of a wider European culture. They're monuments of kingship, and they fall within this troublesome period from the middle of the 10th century to the middle of the 11th century. They carry on afterwards, but it's their early history which is important, because it seems to me that it indicates something significant happening in terms of kingship and its expression in the landscape in Ireland. A second problem in this period has to do with rural settlement. There are lots of other problems, by the way, as well. I'm just picking two. If it was only two, it'd be fine. We'd have to make some more. But what happens with Irish settlement? Here's a bog standard ring fort reconstructed, and we have this model of Ireland being full of these sort of settlements, enclosed and unenclosed, and they're all very primitive, essentially. But the Vikings come along with their towns, etc., etc., etc. And then, of course, the Anglo-Normans arrive, and they build castles and villages and charter towns, etc., etc. as well. So again, the transformation from something which goes back quite a long way to what happens with the Anglo-Normans seems quite dramatic. Whenever the clouds sort of part in a period where you've got no evidence, or you think you've got no evidence, and the clouds part and suddenly the light shines through, every transformation seems bigger than it actually is. Does it seamlessly go from this during the first millennium AD to the age of the Anglo-Normans with new castles and new towns? No, it doesn't. I think there's something else happening, and it again involves kingship. Two sites here, Rathmore on the right-hand side. Classic Anglo-Norman motte, you will say. Granard down here at the bottom, classic Anglo-Norman motte. These are documented Anglo-Norman castles from the late 12th century, but in each case, as with other sites, there's very good evidence, historical evidence, to indicate that these are sites of kingship before the invasion. So what the Anglo-Normans have done in these cases, and I think I picked these two because these two are very clear in the landscape, is that they've appropriated earlier royal monuments. They've put their castles in on top of them. In fact, they haven't just put their castles in on top. What they've done is they've taken monuments which were already mounded and heightened them. So clearly these monuments are working because native people understand what the Anglo-Normans have done to these monuments. They've appropriated the language, so to speak. So it shows it shows something that we know very well for Normans and Anglo-Normans. their familiarity with what it is that they've inherited and how they can adapt it and use it for strategic value. I think, for example, a place like Colchester, William's great palace keep built on top of a Roman temple with Roman material and so on. In fact, only last night in the hotel, I finished the first draft of an article. This is just a little footnote here on Edward I and the landscape of medieval Roscommon west of the Shannon. And Edward in the 1270s, a whole 100 years on again, Edward built this big stone castle in the middle of Roscommon, and it's the dry run for Harlech and Conway and so on. It's the first one of the big concentric ones he built, and he built it beside a lake. And people have said that he built it beside a lake because the lake provides a moat and protection and so on. But actually, the lake was called the Lake of the Birds, and it features in the Ulster cycle as the entrance to the underworld. And that's what he builds the castle there for. So these guys understand landscape, they understand its symbolism, they understand the sort of, the landscape stuff that Leonie was talking about. It's not just about dots on a map and arrows for soldiers to go out into the field. They understand landscape as sort of a living thing, living place where people have invested stories and so on. So this 950 to 1050 period, yes, there is transformation going on, and it's a transformation in which kingship appears quite prominently. It's the era in which we get Irish kings for the first time, billeting troops on the landscape, clearly using the landscape as a means of generating revenue. We've the land being divided up into territorial units called townlands for the first time. This is the age in which Irish kings go feudal, in inverted commas, because we know that's like Norman. That's another tricky word. Let's move on into the Norman period. Let's call it Normanitas. It sounds impressive, if nothing else. We don't have Normans here in the very narrow sense. We're not invaded until after Henry II becomes king. That's not to say there are no Normans in Ireland, of course, just like there were Romans in Ireland trading, etc. But we're not part of the Norman world. We're not part of the Norman empire, as Jean Le Paterel described it. But Norman England has an effect on Ireland. It has a very important effect on Ireland. Norman England is central to driving the reform of the Irish Church. The Irish Church has been slightly backward in its practices for a long, long time. And by the time you reach 1100, it's obvious that we're different. We've got bishops, but they, and they're needed for sacraments. They're needed for, ordaining priests and so on. But they don't have territorial jurisdictions, which they're supposed to have. And we've got an awful lot of bishops as well. We've more bishops than we need. And also we don't have reformed monasticism. We don't have the great reformed monastic orders in Ireland. So there's a need for the Irish Church to change its practices. And also, abbots are passing on abbacies to their sons. They're not supposed to have sons, but they all. This is a strange church. Strange practices, Irish Church. Those words go so well together even today. But the reform of the Irish Church is being pushed from Norman England. It's the Archbishops of Canterbury who are writing to the Irish king saying, look, you do need to reform. And the first great reforming synod of the Irish Church, which is 1101, takes place up on the Rock of Cashin in Tipperary, and it has been driven by the English Church. It's been driven from Canterbury. And there is a school of thought that we could be here all day talking about, which is that the invasion of 1169 is authorised by the Pope because Canterbury wants Ireland invaded, because Canterbury is afraid of losing its influence in Ireland, because the Irish churchmen, once reformed, are beginning to sort of loosen the apron strings a little bit. So Norman England plays a really important role in what happens to the Irish Church. But you talk about sort of hybridity and how that manifests itself. Here's an Irish high cross, an ancient monument type. Look at the bishop. Bishop appears on a high cross for the first time. He's lost his hand, but it shows how important new bishops and new diocesan territories are after 1101. And this influence from Norman England then manifests itself in architecture, obviously, with Ireland's version of Romanesque. Here's the Plum Building. This is Cormac's Chapel, 1127, 1134. Small little building. It's clearly been scaled down from a larger building. It's like one of those crisp bags that you throw in the fire and you pull it out as it's shrunk down to nothingness. It's a little reduction. It's like a little photocopy of a larger building. Everything inside it is taken from something bigger. But here's the east end of it, and there's some nice rib vaulting. This is very early rib vaulting, actually, if you think about it. This building is consecrated in 1134, and anybody is invited to the consecration. So this is really first generation Anglo-Norman rib vaulting in Ireland. It is tempting to say, and I've said this in print in the past, and now I just don't believe it, that Ireland's Romanesque is an expression of reform. The reason the Irish are building doorways with chevron is they're indicating their reform allegiance. That's what this is about. It's communicating to people that my church, which has a roundy arched doorway with chevron, my church is a church which belongs within the reform. We have reformed. We support the local diocesan bishop. We're all in favour of St. Benedict and St. Augustine, and we think this is fantastic, and we welcome the change. I'm less inclined to think that now, and one of the monuments that has made me think differently is this one, Dromiskin in County Louth. There's a little round tower, it's been truncated, and there's a Romanesque doorway. The only example in Ireland, by the way, of a doorway with proper shafts tucked into the little return angle. We don't get those. It's a unique doorway. Romanesque architecture in Ireland is very southern. It's not in the north, and yet the Canterbury of Ireland was Armagh. So if Romanesque is articulating a reform ideal, it should be up north, and yet it's not. The Dromiskin is up in the north. It's one of the few Romanesque monuments. So it's a very hard monument to explain. I'm now inclined to think, and I can't go into it here, but I'm now inclined to think that the appearance of Romanesque is again about kingship. It's about local patrons making statements, that it's not really about reform at all. It's about kings saying that, that their worldview embraces Norman culture. I think the reform card has been overplayed by me as well as others. Third part, 12th century then, influence from England with church reform. Are there other things going on? Are there impulses from elsewhere? Yes, there are, and I want to show you these very briefly to make the point that although we're right beside you, although we're right beside Norman England, things are coming into Ireland which are bypassing England. And I think this is a really interesting general observation, and one that might have significance within this workshop context as these conversations go on. For example, we've got Western French influence that comes into us and just bypasses you. On the left-hand side, for example, is Clonfert in Galway. It's an extraordinary doorway of about 1180. It's got some zigzag on some of the columns here, sort of pretend columns, but it doesn't have chevron on any of the arches. It's multi-ordered, but it's got little biting animal heads. It's got a scalloped archivolt. It's got sort of face masks. It's got lots of Western French motifs on it, and of course, it's in Western Ireland, accessible to France via the Shannon. In fact, when this doorway is made, the Anglo-Normans have just invaded Ireland, and it's entirely conceivable, for multiple reasons, which I can't go into, entirely conceivable that the builder of this doorway actually recognises that there's nothing English on this doorway. You almost had to go out of your way. Actually, you had to go out of your way. You had to work hard to build a doorway that big and leave out English influence. I mean, it really is very hard. After the third archivolt, you think, well, what will we do next? You think, God, we can't use chevron, so what do we do? And on the right-hand side is Ardmore from late in the 12th century, on the south coast, again, facing France, more accessible to the Bay of Biscay than to Dover. This rebuilt facade, I'll just draw your attention to this here. That's a tiny little horseman figure of the type you get all over Western France. Horseman figure on the left-hand side of the facade, facing south. Classic location, Civray, and all these other places. And other features of that sculpture suggest France as well. So there is French influence. And it comes to us bypassing you. That's easily done in a sense, in that you just go from France to Ireland. You don't need to pass England. But the other impulse, which I think is very interesting, is the German. I think Germany hasn't featured yet, but I think by the end of this series of workshops, it probably will. Cashel. Cashel's got a pair of towers, like German towers like Regensburg. There were Irish Benedictine communities on the continent in Central Europe who actually came to Ireland. They came to Cashel raising money. So Cashel has a direct connection with Central Europe, with southern Germany. So yes, I know you get towers like this in some English churches like Exeter and Hereford had them and so on. But these are very German-looking towers, and it's no coincidence that Benedictines from Germany, from Regensburg, turned up in the early 12th century in Cashel. And moreover, as the late Donegal Curran died recently, pointed out, the coronation ceremonies of the kings of Munster, as in the king who built this chapel, were modelled on German imperial coronation ceremonies. So there's a strong German-Irish connection at work. There may also be a strong German connection in things, some of our shrines. Here's the shrine of St. Lachtan's Arm and 2 other German shrines. I'm not going to make a deal about this because I just get nervous when I see squiggly art. I don't know if that's a Ringerike, Ornis, or if people even use these words anymore. But perhaps the most interesting and revealing German connection is Christ Church in Dublin. The crypt of Christ Church Cathedral is normally regarded as being Anglo-Norman, but in fact there's strong evidence to indicate it's German as well. The best parallels for this, I published this 15 years ago, are actually in the central Rhineland, in the Cologne area. Since then, Rhineluff Line and Pádraig Ó Rian have independently looked at the martyrology in Christ Church and the list of relics, and have found that they are predominantly German. And Dagmar Ó Rian has recently suggested that the first Archbishop of Dublin was actually trained in Cologne. The first bishop, Donatus, went on pilgrimage to Rome in 1028 with the King of Dublin. It's clear they came back through Germany, and German influence is what explains the crypt of Christ Church. So actually, not only do we have early German architecture, the cloister must have been original to it as well. So we have a cloister in Dublin around 1030, which is a good early date for a cloister. What this suggests basically is that you don't mind the French stuff in the 12th century. That can go around the coast. That can avoid England. German stuff is coming into Ireland and avoiding England. And I think the next stage of research for us in Ireland is to consider afresh the role of Germany in the transformation of Ireland in the 10th century. To what extent has Ireland been transformed by our connections with Germany before the English get involved in the reform of the native church? My final point, the soft border, I couldn't resist it. I didn't know this morning, but what were you doing? I don't hold you personally for Brexit, by the way. I've yet to meet an English person who voted for it. This has been about looking at places outside the Norman world. Ireland is clearly experiencing influence from England. You would expect it. So ideas are coming in from England. They're also coming in from Germany. They're also coming in from France. So these are soft borders. In the truest sense, these are permeable borders. But I want to just raise a possibility that maybe ideas go back as well. And I want to highlight one site in particular. I've put this up, first of all. This is Galto, a very famous site. Time has moved on since this was done, but in its day, this was an eye-opening site for understanding, the Saxon into Norman, etc., etc., etc. And the question of continuity is one that we've already discussed here. And Saxon Norman, what does it mean, and so on. There is a site in Ireland which I think is extremely important and may someday come to be recognised as an Irish Galto in an historiographical sense. And that's this site of Dunate in County Down. And I want to finish with this. Because the narrative has always been that we are influenced from outside, that ideas travel from east to west, that ideas travel from England and Germany and so on up towards us in the corner of Europe, and that we've got very little to give back. That's the wrong sort of question. It's not about giving back. It's not about somebody, it's not about one-upmanship, it's not about striking a bargain. It's about a constant flow of ideas. It's a sort of it's a big pot, and everything is getting mixed around, and ideas are running freely across these borders. But this site in Dunate is one that I think, were we to use the casserole metaphor, were we to sort of season the casserole with a little sprinkling of Dunate, we may understand the word we're talking about a little bit differently. It's a motte and bailey, as you can see. This was excavated in the 1950s, a little bit of an excavation, and what was discovered was it's built on top of an earlier monument. That's fine. The earlier monument is recorded historically as Dunachtach, and it is recorded that the Dún and Baile were destroyed. The Dún was burned, the Baile was broken down. Now, Dún means fort in Irish, and sites with Dún are often elevated. Baile is a word that usually describes a settlement, like a town, like a village. But Francis John Byrne, who's probably our most eminent early historian, suggested to me once that Baile may actually be the origin of the word Bailey. Now, I'm no linguistic expert, so I don't know, but Francis John is one of those people. If he says it, it might just be correct. So, before the Anglo-Normans come, there's a Dún and Baile at Dunate, which are destroyed. The Anglo-Normans come, they re-edify the site, and you get a motte and bailey. So the Dún and Baile of Dunate is very likely to be a motte and bailey. What is the date of the destruction of the motte and bailey of Dunate? What date do you think? I bet none of you would guess the date it is. And remembering our chickens, the date is 1004 AD. That's an incredibly early date. And if it's documented, it's royal. Why do I point this out to you? I don't have any answers, but I think if we were to put these sites and this Irish stuff into the mix, it will help us understand these processes a little bit better, and also help us understand the chronology a little bit better. And if you've got early things happening in Ireland, then I think that's very interesting, because we're not supposed to have the early things. We're supposed to receive. We're not supposed to give. Okay, thank you.